Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next Show and Share, which is part of a series of online events that we're doing for Barnet Citizens Assembly. The Show and Share that we are doing today is about the last session of the Citizens Assembly that we just had on Saturday, the 22nd of April, which happened from 9:30 to 3:30 at Middlesex University's Hendon campus. Welcome to everybody on the call. My name is Kelly McBride. I am the lead facilitator along with my colleague Hannah and a team of facilitators we have. And I work for an organisation called TPX Impact, who've partnered with Barnet Council to deliver on the design and facilitation of the process. So very welcome if you're here for the first time. This is the 5th Show and Share that we have done, and it's the last one that we're actually doing as part of this series before we then come to present the recommendations from the process, which will be coming out in May and then reported on in June. So if you haven't been to a Show and Share before, really they are an opportunity to find out more about Barnet Citizens Assembly, to hear a little bit more about what we did in the particular session the Show and Share is connected to, and it's an opportunity for you to also ask any questions about the process. What we tend to do is run through basically what we did in the sessions. What we tend not to do is to share lots of detail about what participants have been discussing and where they've got to with their draft recommendations, just so we don't unduly influence the work that they're doing at any moment in time, but very happy to take questions around broad and general themes and things like that. As I'm talking, please do keep yourself on mute and do introduce yourself in the chat. I can see someone has already started doing that. And you're very welcome to post any questions that pop into your head along the way as well, either in the chat or at the end in the Q&A if you want to unmute yourself and ask them verbally. So I'm going to start just with a little bit of an introduction to Barnet Citizens Assembly. You would have heard this before if you've been to any previous Show and Shares. But Citizens Assembly generally is something that brings together a group of randomly selected everyday people to learn, to deliberate and to make recommendations together. So in this process, we brought together 40 members of the Barnet community, having sent out 8,000 invitations to households across the borough with our partners at Sortition Foundation, from which those members were selected. And what they're discussing is the following: the fact that Barnet has declared a climate emergency. So what more can we do together to make Barnet more sustainable now and in the future? And that's very much the question that's at the fore of all of their considerations. We have very much intentionally from the beginning said that this is not just going to be a process that ends, but it's something that we want to see continued engagement around afterwards. So we have also been talking about next steps and what happens after the assembly. So just so you know, we are looking at opportunities for members to present recommendations to elected representatives, as you would always expect in a citizens' assembly, and that will probably be at Barnet Council's cabinet in late June. We're also thinking about a community action planning day, which brings together different people from across Barnet, including businesses and community groups, to plan how to deliver on the Assembly recommendations. And that very much touches on the together part of that question that you saw a moment ago. How do we work together as a borough? There's going to be a celebration for all Assembly members. In fact, I think there's probably going to be more than one. And we're also going to be developing opportunities for members to be involved in monitoring what happens next. And there'll be a discussion about that with the members, including members of the Youth Assembly in May. And of course, there's lots of opportunities for them to tell their stories along the way, should they wish to take those up as well. When we have our assembly sessions, there's a bunch of people in the room. So I've mentioned we have our 40 members of the assembly. We've also got a facilitation team, which is a mix of team from TPX and some locally trained facilitators to start developing some capacity there in Barnet. And we also have invited contributors, who are people that we invite along to give information, evidence or different perspectives to support members on their learning journey. Also in the room, we have observers. So we've been running an observer program as part of this, so people could sign up and register an interest to coming along to a session, basically just watching what happens. And we're also joined by the commissioning team from the council, who are the sustainability team, who are also there in observer capacities unless they've been invited to give contributions, and researchers from Middlesex University, who have been doing some evaluative activities with the members as well. So what did we do on Saturday? So we're at a point in the process generally now where we're starting to really develop our recommendations. So it's a really important point where we're bringing together all of the learning, everything that members know, and starting to develop them into collective recommendations. And coming into this session, we had well over 100 different ideas that have already emerged from the different sessions we had. So they did quite a lot of hard work, I think, to kind of start prioritizing them into things that they would like to be developing into recommendations. So as always, we started with a welcome, an agenda and a recap from previous sessions before we then had an Ask Me Anything panel for about 75 minutes, which brought together some different officers responsible for different areas that we're touching on thematically across the council. I'll tell you who they are in a moment. We then developed ideas into recommendations. So I mentioned we've had this long list of well over 100 different ideas, which they started developing into recommendations. And we also continued our development of the vision, a draft of which we'd brought to a previous meeting based on some work they'd done a few weeks ago now. And the final thing that we did this Saturday was we reviewed options for decision making. So I'm just going to tell you about each of those different elements in turn. So the Ask Me Anything panel was us being responsive to requests that had come from the participants about what further information they need to start developing their recommendations, and what questions they still had about climate change, sustainability, and what was going on in Barnet. So what we did, and you can see the panel right in front of you there in that picture there, was we identified people within the council who come and respond to many of those questions. And they all had a couple of minutes at the beginning just to introduce themselves, their role, and to share a little bit more about what's already going on in relation to the work they're doing in Barnet, before we put to them some of the questions which they had seen in advance at this point that had come directly from the Assembly members that we had gathered in previous sessions. And then there was an open space for members to ask the panel any questions that they still had that would help them throughout the day and throughout the task of developing their recommendations. So this is who we had. We had people that were representing sustainability. We had the Deputy Chief Executive Officer, we had the Assistant Director of Estates and Decarbonisation, the Director of Street Scene, the Public Health team, a representative from there, the Green Spaces Service Manager, and the Assistant Service Director for Planning. So yeah, that was a good session. People asked questions as you would expect, and I think they got a lot of information. And then we moved on to developing our recommendations. So for this session, we kept all of those people that were on the panel in the room, and we considered them kind of experts on tap, as it were, so that at any point if people had questions, they could draw on them. And we were also joined by Shireen, who works in community partnerships at the co-op, because there's quite a lot of questions around waste and food and things like that. And we also had someone representing the comms and engagement team at Barnet Council too. So basically how this session worked, and they had a good couple of hours to go through this, was we started at a point of looking at challenges. So participants essentially discussed and agreed the biggest challenges Barnet was facing becoming more sustainable, and I'll tell you what they were in a moment. And they had an opportunity to also, during this point, introduce new ideas into the process for consideration. On their tables, they had printouts of all of the ideas that they had shared that had been kind of clustered together, and we sense checked all of that with them in microgroups along the way. So that was available for them on the table to review at any point in time. We wanted to do some plenary feedback during this session. So from each table, we did hear what their key challenges were and any new ideas they wanted to throw into the mix before we went into the second step, which was reviewing, discussing. So they spent some time looking at all of the ideas that had been shared so far, and then working individually and collectively to identify some of the ideas that they thought should become a key recommendation from this assembly. So you can imagine at each of the different tables at this point, we had kind of like a long list, as it were, of things that they felt should be a priority. And then in the next step, they worked together in small groups to identify a number of different ideas at their tables to shortlist. And then these were brought together across the room and collated and read back to the room as well. And we had more feedback along the way. In terms of the challenges they identified, I'm really happy to share these with you. They came up essentially with 10 different challenge areas. So when they were developing their recommendations, they were also thinking about these challenges and what might be needed to address them. So just some headlines. They talked about challenges related to financial challenges, to changing attitudes, to changing habits and behaviours, communication and education, balancing priorities and sustainability goals, population growth and the pressure, particularly this puts on infrastructure in the borough, the complexity of managing change so that it also supports residents. And we talked about things like fairness and equity in previous sessions, communication and partnership with business and retailers, infrastructure and transport. And within that whole messaging about how we're working together as a borough. And then, yeah, they went through the task of developing recommendations. So essentially they had sheets that once they'd reached consensus at their table about what they wanted to put forward, they're captured on these sheets. These were all put up so everyone in the room could see them. And you can see my colleague Hannah there, my other co-lead facilitator, reading out basically what had come up across the room. So yeah, we have a good set of draft recommendations to work with going into the next session. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're planning to do between now and then, but we're going to do a bit more sense checking with members. But the other thing that we did after our lunch break was starting to develop the vision a little bit more. And this is the second step in 3 steps really that we have to do this. We'll be finalising it in May. So in this, we started just with some conversation in pairs, just to get ourselves into the headspace for some vision making. And then because we've already got draft sections of the vision, facilitators rotated around tables with those drafts, and then participants worked on developing those different sections. They could change, add or delete different parts, and they also spent some time suggesting rewrites of particular parts, so doing some actual drafting together. And to do this task, we had prepared some drafting notes for them, which was based on feedback that we got from members during some microgroup sessions that we held last week. So basically a microgroup is a session that we hold online for about 1 hour where people can come along. It's completely optional, but we did have members coming along to give some interim feedback to the design and facilitation team along the way, so we can bring back the best information for them to do the task in the next sessions. But we also put everything into a Google Doc and linked it through our microsite, so they could pop on and view their draft vision at any point between sessions should they wish, and add some notes. We also gave them some prompts because we had noticed in previous sessions it was quite hard to get out of the headspace of thinking about the future for yourself. So we suggested if that was really difficult, to maybe try and think about people with different experiences across Barnet and how they are kind of feeling this more sustainable Barnet in the future. So we just gave some different kind of prompts and some profiles that you see up here. You know, imagine students living with friends, parents and small business owners, single office workers and retirees with young grandchildren, for example. And another thing that we did just to prompt some thinking was share with them the young people's postcards from the future. So you may or may not know that there is also a parallel young people's process running alongside this Citizens Assembly with 20 young people. And in their last session, they basically wrote some postcards from the future, which you would have heard about in the last show and share. And since then, we've been working with a fantastic graphic illustrator who's drawn their postcards for the future, which talks about a bit about their vision into some graphic illustrations. And that's what you can see up on this slide here. So on the day, we had these up on a board for the participants of the Assembly to look at, as well as the young people's developing theory of change and some of their ideas, just to prompt some inspiration and maybe for them to see where there is a bit of overlap too. And then the final part of the session was making decisions. And we very intentionally, as a team, wanted to ensure that participants had the opportunity to talk about how we make decisions rather than us presenting how they were going to make decisions, if that makes sense. So we talked a little bit about the framework in which we're thinking about the recommendations and the different actors and places we're trying to share them with. So we talked about me, so you know, what recommendations might be relevant to me as a person, as a resident in Barnet, to my place in community and to the council and partners, and how do they all work together to make Barnet more sustainable now and in the future. So as people have been developing recommendations, and certainly when we come to put in more substance around them in our next session in May, participants will be thinking about what they, as individuals, as residents, might need in order to learn and take action to make Barnet more sustainable, what needs to happen in our places and communities, and how the council and their partners can act as connectors, enablers and influencers. And so within that framework to which recommendations will be connected, we discussed options for how we should essentially present the recommendations, how we should vote. So should we have single thresholds, maybe 75% or 80% of members in support of each recommendation for it to become one, or levels of support where we look at degrees of agreement or not across the Assembly for each idea, and we could present that in a particular way. And we also discuss options for how we frame the ballot. So yeah, they basically had some worksheets to work through and shared their preferences, which we're currently just tallying up, and then we'll be going back to them to share quite openly what preferences have come out and what we'll be going with. So that was it. That's what we did on Saturday. Quite a lot of stuff, but it was a brilliant session. I think everyone was really engaged through to the end. But it's by no means the end of our journey. There's lots more work to do. So what does happen next? So we did sense check this with the members, and people were in agreement that it should happen, and gave a couple of suggestions for other bits of information they'd like to see included. But Barnet Council will conduct a light impact assessment on the current draft recommendations to give participants a little bit more information to make their final decisions. And that's primarily going to look at the impact on carbon, the cost and the timeline. But there might be a couple of other bits that they'll include in that too. We're also going to be hosting more optional microgroup meetings to review the draft recommendations and plans for developing them, ready to bring back to our final session. And there'll also be an offer for members to come along to a meeting as part of a drafting group for the vision, just to look over in a bit more detail the next version of that. And in May, participants are going to finalise and vote on the recommendations. And in that last session, we're going to invite the Young People's Assembly along. So we're now bringing the assemblies together, which I think will be a wonderful moment. And we're exploring a few other opportunities for them to communicate in between sessions as well. So that's it, mostly for the share part of this. But just to say, do keep in touch via Barnet Citizens Assembly website. We're still uploading content on there onto the engage.barnet.gov.uk site, and that includes the video from this session. And I just wanted to flag, as part of the Barnet Zero campaign, there has been a bunch of activity around Earth Day, which just so happened to also be on Saturday just past. And on there, you can see a brilliant video and some brilliant clips from the Young People's Assembly, where they've urged some action on climate change ahead of that day. So in terms of future sessions, we're very much getting towards the end. So we've now got just one session left of the Young People's Assembly on the 13th of May, and just that final weekend of the Citizens Assembly on the 20th and 21st of May. And out of those will be coming the recommendations from this whole Citizens Assembly process. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm also going to stop the recording and then open up for any questions that we have. Thanks.